Welcome everyone to this week's episode of Embodied. I am so thrilled that I get to spend the afternoon grilling the incredible woman in front of me and that I get to bring all of her wisdom and her beauty and her deep service to you. This is going to be a corker of an episode, and it's themed around a topic that, as many of you guys know, is completely dear to my heart, my body, my cellular makeup. Renee McGregor, who is our incredible guest today, is an internationally renowned sports nutritionist. She's much, much more than that. She's an expert across multiple fields, but the one that she particularly supports people with right now is, and actually through her career, the entire time that I've known her, is REDS, which is looking at the athletes within the industry, many of them really high ranking, who suffer from some form of under-resourcing challenge. And I originally met Renee, we were trying to work it out maybe 8 or 9 years ago, because she was the second nutritionist that I got the opportunity to see when I was recovering from anorexia wave 2. And she was the first of the medical establishment that I was exposed to who treated me with such generosity and grace and normality. I remember Renee coming to see you for the first session, and we went down into this lower ground floor room. I remember exactly the layout of the room. I remember exactly what you were wearing. I remember exactly how terrified I was, because it's an incredibly exposing thing to share the intimacy of your disorder, which is what it is, with somebody else. And you had this incredible quality of laying the groundwork for me, being really simple and clear, like, this is what will happen if, this is what happens when. But you did it with such a generosity of heart and enough of the relatability of your own story that it really, really shifted something for me. It gave me the feeling of permission, that I was allowed to be me. I was allowed to be me with the desires that I had to be deeply in movement as a practitioner. I was allowed to be me wanting to live a bigger life. And I was allowed to be me with this problem that I was facing and that I had faced for the past 2 decades. And I will never forget that, because the humanity of that experience is what's left the imprint of you in me ever since. You know, we worked together for a couple of years. It was an incredible boost and boon and reformulation of how I looked at food and how I looked at my body. And ever since creating the podcast 3.5 years ago, I've been bloody determined to get you onto the airwaves. I gather I'm not the only one, though, because now everyone knows you and everyone wants you, and you're into your soon-to-be 7th book and your own documentary. It's just been so incredible to watch your trajectory. But I want to start this with such enormous thanks for the care that you took, which I know is the care that you take for everyone that you reach, whether it's directing one-to-one, whether it's through your events, or whether it's through just what you share on social. That's my starting point.
Well, thank you. What an amazing introduction. And it's not often as a practitioner that you get to hear how somebody else experiences you. So thank you for sharing that, and actually for reassuring me that I do create the environment that I always hope to create, because, you know, you think you are, but sometimes you don't always get it right. So that means a lot to me. So I really appreciate your kind words, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And what a beautifully named podcast. I love that. It's one of my favorite words. So there you go. There's a little snippet into me that I love that word so much. So yeah, so thank you.
So I'm going to give the listeners a tiny bit of background, which is that come year 2, I no longer came to see you in Bath, and I came to visit you in your incredible, gorgeous stonework cottage in Bradford-on-Avon, which is, if anyone hasn't been, it's the sort of space of country magic, winding roads and perfectly placed coffee shops and little rivulets of water running through. And I entered into the space and was met by a dog and legacy of 2 daughters. And it feels really important to bring all of those things in, because I think part of why you are special as a practitioner, you have all of the scientific medical stripes and actually all of the industry respect for what you do. You have all of that, all of the credentialing. And I think credentialing is really important, not least because in the role that you're in, you are an educator and there is weight to your words, especially now. And so one of the things that I know that you're really public about is how important it is to be scrutinizing where you're gathering your insights and your data from as a member of the average audience that doesn't necessarily have the background that you have. So I hold your caliber in huge esteem, but you are also a mum of two. You have also been through your own journey with ED and intensive exercise feats. You now live in the mountains, which is no surprise to me. You're a dog mum, you're a wife, the human of you is such a big part of what you do, and the story of you is such a big part of what you do. What do you think it was that gave you such a drive?
It's a big question. And just to say before I answer that question, I'm now a dog mum to 2 dogs. So we still have the original dog, who is now nearly 14, bless him, and he's doing all right. He's a bit slower, but he's doing all right. But he was a very good therapy dog, and we now have a new addition who is 5, and he's also a very good therapy dog, but he also shows more signs of anxiety than calming. But that's okay. We're allowed to have different personalities in the same home, so it's all good. So I just wanted to add that in. But yes, I'm still a dog mum, very much a dog lover. So Anthea, I guess to answer your question, I suppose I think that the answer to your question has probably evolved over time, right? And I think when I met you, for example, I had just come out of a very complicated and difficult marriage, and I was navigating being a single mum for the first time, and also, I guess, learning to find my way by myself. Like, I think I got married very young. I had children very young, and so I guess I'd never really needed to fend for myself in the same way as at that point was so poignant. But I guess also I had worked in quite a few different environments by that point. I sort of started life out as a clinical dietitian working in the NHS, and then I moved in various roles within the NHS, but eventually kind of ended up in eating disorders, but particularly like adolescent eating disorders. And I guess that's where I gained a lot of knowledge. And I guess just to kind of caveat that, I never thought I was destined to work in eating disorders. I think having had my own experience and my own experience of recovery was so horrific, and the experience of working with an eating disorder team and service within the NHS was so awful that when I became a dietitian, I was really adamant that that was not an area, a speciality I was going to go in. But obviously, as part of your training, you have to experience it. And then actually, as I moved through the ranks and ended up sort of in the pediatric area, because that's where I did further qualifications in pediatric dietetics and ended up working in pediatrics, again, across many different disciplines for quite a few years. But you often cover like a general medical ward, and you always end up with individuals who have eating disorders because that's where they are placed, particularly when things are very, very tricky. And what I noticed was that when these young people came in, there was a lot of, again, I guess from my own experience, I never wanted someone who was feeling that vulnerable and that lost and that isolated and really like unheard. I never wanted them to experience, I guess, what I had experienced. And so even though it wasn't something I was like, okay, I don't really want to work in this, but these people are under my care, so I have to provide them with what I didn't have, which was basically just a big bag full of compassion, right? And an opportunity for them to feel like a human being and not to feel the shame and stigma that is often so clearly associated with having an eating disorder. And I guess over that time, then I ended up realizing that I was really good at working in this field. And actually, although it was challenging, I really enjoyed it because don't get me wrong, not everybody you work with comes out of it well. But when they do, it's so rewarding, more rewarding than I can ever experience in any other speciality, that I was like, okay, I can make a difference here and I can help people, and it feels this feels like rewarding for me. Like I've got a bit of a purpose. And I know it might sound a bit spiritual, but I guess at that point I was like, maybe this is what my job is. This is my purpose. This is why I've been put on this planet, and why I had to experience the experiences I did, is to be able to move this forward, perhaps. And I guess, this is a long time ago now. We're talking, back in sort of 2008, 2009. So a long, long time ago. But then I got quite frustrated working within the NHS and working kind of within the confinements of the NHS. And so I decided to take a break from the NHS. And I then did my third degree, which was in applied sports nutrition. I've always been active. I've always found a lot of comfort in sport and moving my body. I think a lot of young people who develop eating disorders, particularly as teenagers, we know that there's usually a root cause to that. And I think for a lot of us, it's when we don't feel like we belong and don't fit, but actually movement and being outdoors and being in nature often helps us to emotionally regulate. So we're pretty kind of drawn to those situations. And so I did this third degree and then ended up working with athletes. But what I didn't really anticipate was the number of athletes that would have complicated relationships with food. So obviously, once I started seeing this pattern, and I again was helping sports teams, and it was even more important within sporting environments, because obviously in the NHS, it's a clinical environment, it's a clinical condition, you're supported by psychologists, psychiatrists, medics. Whereas in the sports world, yes, you have this incredible sports team, but nobody understood eating disorders. And I was like the person who was then educating the coaches and the physios and everybody else. And so I guess I found my niche again. I was like, okay, well, there's a really big overlap here between eating disorders and sport. And I understand why there is this, but somebody needs to bridge this gap between sports and clinical. Otherwise, all these athletes are going to end up in a really bad way, and it's career over, right? For a lot. So I guess that's where you met me, was at that intersection of my life where I'd kind of moved away from, I guess, real clinical work. I was setting myself up on my own for the first time. I was dealing with my own personal experiences and challenges, but also really determined to make the world feel like a kinder place, even if it was just for 1 hour a week for the people that were coming to work with me. But that was really, really important to me. And I think that is really why I do what I do. I've spent the majority of my life, particularly the first half of my life, not being heard, often being overlooked, my needs not being met, and being made to feel incredibly insignificant and irrelevant. And I was like, I am not going to be that person. I am going to listen. I am going to encourage people to be heard. I am going to provide people with care. And I'm going to help them navigate their journey, no matter how long it takes, because that's what you do. You sit in this with someone. When you show true compassion, and I think that's the difference, right? You have these two words, don't we? We have empathy and we have compassion. And people often get the two confused. And obviously, empathy goes so far. But to be truly compassionate, you have to be able to sit in a space with someone without really judgment and without really trying to fix them. You're just sitting in it with them. And that was really important to me. So that is where I guess it came from, is that I wanted to give back what I never had, but I knew was really, really pivotal in helping people recover, particularly when they're so vulnerable.
I mean, you and I couldn't sing more from the same hymn sheet on that. As you were talking about that distinction between empathy and compassion, the statement that was coming up inside of me was, well, yeah, compassion implies not just that you're forgiven, but that there's nothing to forgive. And I think so often, and I see this so much, in some ways, you and I have ended up with similar spiritual / professional mission points that do center around our own stories. I'm writing my first book at the moment, and it's very heavily themed on understanding anorexia and its root causes and suffering, but more than anorexia, understanding generally addictive or distorted processes, like what's going on for the sufferer there. But I've seen and therefore worked with so many anorexics in the last decade, and I can't describe how many of them sit down knowing the impact that they're creating on themselves on some level, knowing the impact that they're creating on their families on some level, feeling like such the problem, the misunderstood, underheard problem. There's such intensive shame, and there's such intensive defense and secrecy and isolation. And that's why I think what you do is really extraordinary, and it's why your desire to change the narrative about how prevalent eating disorders are, how often they go undiagnosed for decades at a time because people aren't ill enough that they register. I mean, you know this, I think, but when I first went to self-declare that I had a problem, I was too weight stable to be admitted to any kind of therapeutic treatment, and that was through private medical routes. So we've got something wrong as a society if our only metric is what's the size that you are, and if that metric has to be disastrously low in order for somebody to receive help, especially athletes at the top of their game, where their sustained endurance and capacity is surely in the interests of the entire team that are supporting them. So I say all of that because it doesn't surprise me at all that you've been in this fascinating educational role, but I guess part of me is so surprised, understanding it from the inside as we both do, why it is that this discourse isn't louder or better understood. What's your take on that? Why we haven't focused on it as a society?
I think eating disorders scare people. And I say that because I had a conversation very recently with a medic, and I was talking to him about something completely different, but we ended up having a conversation about eating disorders, and I was explaining to him that, well, an eating disorder is a coping mechanism. It's a path that no one chooses, and it's not like a conscious decision that you're going to do it. But often when life events occur where very complicated and uncomfortable emotions and feelings are evoked in you for whatever reason, and there's no hierarchy of traumatic events, but for whatever reason, and especially when you're younger and you don't have the emotional maturity to understand what's going on for you, but also if you come from an environment where perhaps there isn't the nurture that you require, and there isn't the understanding and the ability for the guardians around you to kind of hold your anxiety, then you have to find a way to distance yourself and disconnect from those really difficult emotions and feelings. And I think people often get very confused, don't they, about emotions and feelings, and again, the two are often interchanged. But as I understand it, emotions are like the physical sensation that we experience first, and feelings is the kind of word that you kind of attach to that, and it's very much related to what you might be thinking at the time, which is why it's so important to spend time in the emotion to truly connect with it and appreciate what is it I'm truly believing here, what is really going on for me here. And I think, if I use myself an example, and I use myself an example when I was talking to this medic, that, my eating disorder developed, I was 13 when my eating disorder developed, so a very long time ago, but it developed really in response to accumulative kind of experiences. I was unfortunately a victim of sexual abuse when I was younger, and then there was a lot of racism, and I had quite a very critical and unavailable mother. There were lots of things, and I guess that all leaded into me experiencing this sense of I'm wrong, I'm a disappointment, and that very much felt like this constant dis-ease within my body when I couldn't understand what that dis-ease was. But obviously at the time when I was 13, I remember I just started my periods, like I'd had 3 periods, and I just remember that I thought it was all related to being a teenager and feeling uncomfortable in my body. And again, there'd been some remarks my mum had made about my periods starting and how it was not the right time and I was too young. And obviously there's a reason why I've started, that again, just kind of that criticism of this is wrong. Your body shouldn't be doing this now. And I suppose for me, all of that together was like, okay, I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to feel like this anymore. And it wasn't like a conscious decision, but I guess based on the information I had around me and what I could see. And again, I wasn't accepted at school because I was one of the only Asian girls at school, and I came from a very low socioeconomic class compared to everybody else. And so I really struggled at school to fit in and feel like I belonged. But what I could see was around me, everybody who was tall and slim and blonde and perfect, their lives seemed to be working out for them. So there was this kind of like, well, maybe if I just lost a bit of weight, maybe if I just kind of tried to fit in a bit more and, be more like the others, then everything would be okay. And it doesn't make any sense to me when I say that out aloud to you right now, but that was what kind of was the thought process. But of course, in people who are susceptible, and I will definitely say I've definitely got that biological susceptibility to developing an eating disorder, which is really key. Obviously, any sort of decline in weight and restriction, I guess you don't realize at the time, but suddenly you feel relief. That's the whole thing for me. And as I was trying to explain to this medic, people restrict their intake, or they fixate on their body, or they ruminate about their food and their body and their exercise because all these things distract them from what's really going on. And then you get caught up in that. And that's what an eating disorder is. It's just a defense mechanism. It's trying to protect you from emotions and feelings that are really, really tricky for you. And he turned around to me and he said, I didn't know that. And I said, well, what did you think an eating disorder was about? He said, well, when I was taught it at medical school and I had to go and do my training and I spent some time with a psychiatrist, it was still very much about kind of vanity. And I was like, well, eating disorders are never about vanity. They're never about the body. They're about the physical sensations within the body that the person can't understand, but they're never about what the body looks like. Again, that just becomes the place in which you project onto, because the body is something you can contain, you can control, you can manipulate, and it's something physical, whereas you can't necessarily do that with your thoughts and feelings. And he turned around to me and he's like, whoa, I've been a doctor for like 20 years and you've just taught me something new. So I guess to answer your question, Anthea, is I just don't think people truly understand it. And I think it scares them. And I think the other thing I will say, and I definitely think this is the case when it comes to the NHS, is that obviously one of the consequences, particularly of restrictive eating disorder and also of something like bulimia or, like binge purge, what binge restrict, like the problem is that there are often physical consequences, and the physical consequences are quite scary, right? Like they can get to a point where they're very extreme and very, very scary. And so this person then just becomes a clinical risk. And that's the other thing. They're assessed and they're not seen as a human being that's suffering and struggling and needs support. They're seen as a score. You're a clinical risk because, you're running too much or you're purging every day or whatever. They're not seen as, well, why are those behaviors going on? And so I think also we're medicalizing a very complicated psychiatric illness. And so that's also why I think people just don't want to work with it, because it's frightening to hold that risk. It's quite a scary place to be. And I guess the final kind of piece is that, again, going back to particularly the kind of eating disorder services that I see still going on, and exactly how what I went through is there's a real push for, right, we need to see progress in 6 sessions, 20 sessions, 30 sessions, depending on where you live will depend on what you get. And again, think about my case, there was so much trauma attached to my eating disorder, and my eating disorder was my lifeline. My eating disorder was what I felt kept me safe. It created this protective shield around me, and it kept me safe. And I didn't really understand it, but I just knew that I couldn't let go of it. It was like a life raft, right? It's like I've got to hold on to this. And so to be told that your life raft is going to be pulled away from you without any kind of addition of another potential life raft that could support me, it's a ridiculous notion. And I think again, I'm very, very fortunate. The network I've built up over the years, I work with some very, very incredible psychologists, and I do a lot of peer-to-peer support with them as well. And again, we were talking the other day with one of my colleagues, and she was saying how, one of the reasons she left the NHS was because, again, she would often find that she'd be given this framework of, you've got to get this person well in 6 sessions or whatever. And she'd be like, but this person has got real trauma and needs to do the trauma work. We're not going to see any physical improvements until we deal with some of that trauma work. And I think that's the problem, is that it's an illness that takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. And you have to have the right practitioner who can sit in that with you, hold that risk without making you feel like you're a risk or a problem, and also provide you with additional life rafts that you can bring in and be more consistent with, so that eventually the original life raft, which is no longer really serving you, can be let go of. And I think that's why people struggle with it.
Oh, it's incredible to hear you. And there's so many follow-up questions and ways that we could go with that. The first thing that feels really important to emphasize in what you're describing is that difference between we separate out from the client or the sufferer and we other them, versus we come into a we space together, which is the container for healing. Because you're right that up until that point, the person's seeming container for healing is actually the ED. It is the behavior that they lean into when life feels too unnerving. And I love what you shared about not just that it's the solution, which people use in a tokenistic way, but actually often is not, people are not really understanding what that truly means for the person. But you were talking actually initially about regulation, how when we struggle with emotional regulation, then of course we find coping strategies, and those then become patterns, and those patterns then form into identity. And so you get someone then calcifying what started out as a bad but sort of efficient habit that got them out of the pain that they were in or that they weren't wanting to look at. My recent years has involved a lot of study into the nervous system, and one of the kind of leading theories around addiction generally is that when someone gets into a state of nervous system dysregulation, somewhere in their window of tolerance that is suboptimal, whether that's too activated or whether that's too dorsal, too dipped and depressive, that actually the addictive substance, which you've already by that point patterned as your fix of choice, that's just where the nervous system and then the neurology take you. And I remember when I read it, I was like, God, that makes so much sense, because for me, it was a feeling. It wasn't to do with what I looked like. It was to do with how calm do I feel? My mental savannah just went really clear and clean. And in the cleanness, I got to reconstruct a different identity that wasn't the one that I was shamed and terrified to live within. And so when you're talking, therefore, about the complexity of treating it, it's like, well, yeah, the ED is the symptom of the problem. It's not really the root problem. And therefore, to come towards an individual patient requires that individual patient care and individual patience, because it takes a time to unpick that and to help someone move from deep dissociation and self-critique and feeling unloved and feeling like they don't belong, into a place where they truly, deeply appreciate themselves, stay in themselves when things are difficult, and don't therefore enact behaviours that cause them present and long-term harm. But that's the whole self-love journey, which we're lucky enough to have had to do. But I mean, most people don't have the courage to do for a year, let alone for the decade that it takes on average to recover from an ED.
And I think that's a really relevant point there about kind of, you know, the addictive substance, whether that's exercise, which I see a lot, or whether that's food or not eating food, or whether that's alcohol or whatever it might be. In that moment, because of the dysregulation, you can't see that that's adding to the problem. Like I always explain to a lot of my clients that, you know, when you're not feeding your body appropriately, and that doesn't mean you're underweight, it just means when you're not giving your body enough energy, that will itself dysregulate you, because the human body is so good at monitoring and knows what it needs. And I think, again, often people misinterpret that anxiety that's probably going on for them, which is actually anxiety about, actually, I haven't had enough food, or I've not had enough rest, or I've not had enough, you know, calm time, or whatever it might be. I think they misinterpret that anxiety as there's something wrong with me, because they're so dysregulated. And then they try and fix it, right? And they try and fix it through improving themselves. Because the fixing is, there's something wrong with me, I'm not okay, I need to fix this. And of course, we live in this ridiculous world where everything is so aesthetic and everything is so achievement focused. So we start to believe that, oh, okay, well, you know, if I get that time in my race, or if I finish in the top 3, or if I just could fit into those pairs of trousers, everything will be perfect. And of course it's not. Life's not as simple as that, right? But it gives you that kind of sense. And again, going back to what you were talking about, how, you know, you're not eating, or your relationship with food, it kind of helped you to feel calm. And it's interesting because I always hear that term, I felt calm, but I always question, is it calm or is it numb? Because I think there's a difference. And I'm not, you know, I'm not for 1 minute invalidating what you felt, but I think it's an interesting kind of conversation I often have with a lot of my clients, is calm. Because for me, when you're in a calm space, actually you feel free and you feel accepting of everything, right? Whereas when you're in a numb space, you've just created distance from what you don't want to experience.
I love this. I love this. And it's such an astute point, and thank you for bringing it up. I can tell you I did not feel safe. And when I use the word safe now, it almost has built into it a concept of warmth, whether it's emotional warmth, whether it's relational warmth, whether it's warmth inside of my body. The anorectic experience for me, I created control for sure. I created huge distance between me and the previous power holders. So it was my form of rebellion for sure. And you know, the more you, especially those of you guys that are with us, the more you start to look into this, the more you'll hear all of the theories, and most of the theories about EDs posit that their theory is the correct theory. Oh, it's a power situation, or it's just about control, or it's, you know, it's just about regulation. And I feel like you and I are probably on the same trajectory here, that it's probably all of these things and sometimes none of these things. And you know, to try to understand the human condition and to try to make the human condition concrete throughout a person's lifetime is super artificial, especially given hormonal changes and everything else. So, but I think you're right that it created absolute dissociation from my life, and it created absolute separation from other people. And the texture of that feeling was cold, light, space. And none of that, it's got this really adrenal quality, and like none of that is good for your long-term well-being. I'm going to tangent because I want to ask you about this. I was sitting with a colleague this morning, and she's an incredible coach, and she's one of the people that come into our facilitator training and share her magic. And I ordered a decaf coffee, and she was like, "Oh, we're the same. You've gone for a decaf." And I was like, "Yeah." I've learned over time that if I peak too quickly in the morning, then I don't love my lived experience by the afternoon or the evening. And she, as she does, gazed deeply into my eyes as the resting safe coach and was like inquiring about this. And she said, what do you notice the differences? And I said, what I find is that if I double load my caffeine in the morning, I become really efficient. And there's a quality of my personality that comes out that because I was corporate before and because I love strategy and I love business, I find it fascinating. I become a bit sharp. And it's a little bit too close to that version of me that I created before when I was in restriction. And what happens is that by the afternoon and the evening, when my whole system is like, we don't want to think about work anymore, we want to be the lover, I've actually separated myself out from other human beings by being too dictatorial. And I'm left depleted. And it kind of reminds me of almost the cycle with over exercising, where you go hard and you go peak. And then when you're vulnerable, there is nothing left underneath you to support you. And I just wonder about your take on that, both in relation to caffeine as an expert and also in relation to the over exercise thing and this drive that we have to get it all right now, please.
Yeah, I mean, the exercise thing is really fascinating, right? Because in the 10 years that I've known you, I've seen a real shift in our societally in our relationship with exercise. And I would say it's in 10 years. I think, when I met you, over exercise was still something that we could kind of objectively see in someone and kind of go, okay, that doesn't feel very healthy, right? Whereas now, I'd say definitely in the last 2 to 3 years, I have seen that we're just normalizing over exercise. And so where in the past, when you were working with somebody, like when I was working with you, I could be very sort of gentle with you and help you to understand that, exercise and being healthy didn't mean you had to do several hours a day. Once a day was enough, and actually having rest was also equally as important, because actually that's how you adapt and that's how you benefit. And I think for you, obviously, as you've just kind of spoken so openly about, is the exercise also was a way to create distance from things that were uncomfortable and difficult for you. And I think that is still the case. I think a lot of people that caught up in exercise dependency is their coping mechanism. That is their way of deflecting and dissociating from maybe feelings of being inadequate, or feelings as maybe not quite fitting in, or again, even maybe an attempt to try and be more like they belong in a particular group. Particularly I think about running and ultra running, and it's just kind of, it's sort of burst, like there's again, like I think about elite runners, and generally speaking, they choose 1 or 2 big races a year, even now to this day. Whereas you look at the general public and you look at kind of the influencer market, and they're doing an ultra distance race every month, or 4 or 5 times, and they're not giving their body their chance to recover. Because the thing with exercise is, especially something like running, is that it places a huge amount of stress on your nervous system. So what people don't appreciate is, if you don't give your nervous system a chance to recover, then you stay depleted, and then that builds up. And so I think, when I'm thinking about exercise for myself, and when I'm thinking about choices I make about what races I might do, or what's going on, like I've had a lot of people question me this year about, well, what races are you doing this year? And I've kind of said, well, actually, I'm not doing a big race this year, because I did a big race the last 2 years, which for me was big. I mean, in the grand scheme of ridiculous like distances out there, it's not that big. But to do an 80K race 2 years in a row, that was enough for me. But people are quite surprised, and they're like, oh, so you not got any goals this year? And I'm like, I've got many goals this year, but I just don't have a distance goal, or I don't have a race goal, because actually that's not how I attain my worth, you know. And also I'm very, very mindful that my work is incredibly busy at the moment. And I am feeling quite depleted. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend I'm not. Like I have a very high clinical workload, which means that I am present for people on a daily basis, which in itself is rewarding but exhausting. And I have to make sure that I give myself enough time and energy to restore from that. But I also run a clinic and I have many practitioners and I clinically supervise all my practitioners. So I'm kind of answering queries to them. And then on top of that, I have my consultancy work where, I'm working with brands and organizations and teams and, so it's a busy job. And I have a home, I have a husband and I have two dogs and I have two children. And so I became very conscious last year after I finished my Lakeland 50. I was like, okay, that was great. And I enjoyed the journey, enjoyed the training, I enjoyed the race, and I'm very happy with the way it went and I'm happy with the outcome. I don't need to do that again. Like I was really clear that I was going to draw the line. And then since then I was like, what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? I'm like, I don't feel the need to do anything right now because I know that I need to manage this nervous. And I think that's something as well that when you've been in a massive place of depletion, even way back in the history of your life, like I have, but I do think because of the experiences I've had that led to my eating disorder, because of the sexual abuse, because of the racism, these are still, I guess, these are still situations and scenario, particularly when it comes to racism and being a woman of color and having to really prove myself. I think probably my nervous system is always slightly hypervigilant, and so I'm very conscious that's burning all the time. And I have to really think about rest. So I think people underestimate how much our nervous system does. And it really does do what it says on the tin, right? It is very much your nervous system. It is looking out for you. So I guess when it comes to caffeine, I mean, I'm a big coffee lover. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. I'm quite regimental, I guess, about my coffee. I do have coffee when I wake, but it's more about the routine, making my coffee, I tend to wake first. I come downstairs, I put the coffee on, I sit with my dogs on the sofa, I journal or whatever. I sip my coffee and it's really, again, helps me to regulate in the morning and it's really important to me. And then I probably have one more coffee before I start clinic. And that's it. That's where I draw the line. So I'm quite, and then after that, I don't really drink coffee or tea, if I'm honest. I just try and drink water. And I do generally drink water. I have to say one thing about moving up north, the water tastes amazing. So that makes a big, big difference. So I do drink a lot of water now. But yeah, I guess, I mean, I'm not anti-coffee, but I do think, again, if you recognize that it can have quite a marked impact on you, then I do think people need to make the right decision. I also think, I'm now 50, so I'm in that stage of life where I'm in perimenopause and it's been an interesting journey, that's for sure. And again, anxiety increases, palpitations increase, intrusive thinking, all these things become much more apparent when you're going through this phase of life. And I think that has also made me think, okay, if I'm already feeling a bit jumpy, is coffee really a good idea right now? So I guess I'm learning to manage it, but like I said, I'm not anti it. I think it's understanding your own relationship with it that's the important piece.
I really love that because what you're honing in on is, and I've known this always about you, that you're someone that advocates a degree of presence. And of course, right? But in a sense, if we're thinking about the difference between a dependency and a choice, it's what you're describing in your racing and it's what you're describing. I remember it was one of the first pieces of advice that you gave to me. I was running at the time. It was quite fledgling, but I loved it. And I was still really pretty small. And I remember you being like, just I sometimes feel in the mornings, and I feel for whether I, want to do a yoga class this morning instead of running. And at the time, my brain was like, "What, you don't decide it on the basis of a rule that you set yourself 2 weeks ago that you had to do?" And it was this really radical but incredibly simple principle, which is you have to cultivate a relationship with your body that's intimate enough that you start to feel what it needs. And I think, especially in an overly stimulated world where we're not just inundated all the time, and therefore actually fundamentally many people, especially living in London, are deeply dysregulated, way too much screen time, etc. But we're also, it goes back to what you were talking about before, and I'd love your take on this. You used the word influencer earlier, and I remember when I was doing my little bit of up-to-date Googling on you, which was great fun. I've learned again so much. But when I was doing it, I remember one of the posts that you did, which was a collab post, and it was basically talking about, you want to be really attentive when people are giving you advice. It's not just what's their credentialing, but kind of the implication could be like, what is it that's behind the scenes for that person? And just remembering that you can never know that. And I feel, I suppose, quite passionate about that because it's very, very easy to pretend, especially on a medium where you're creating 10-second reels that keep people screen gazing for the entire time, and you're giving them an edict of the way that they should exercise, and you're implying how they should look. And I have some feelings about the level of neurological dopamine influence that creates, how it takes people outside of their agency as the recipients. And none of that involves presence, really and truly. None of it is encouraging people to go back to, what does it feel like in here and what do I need from in here? I wonder if you feel comfortable to talk about that whole influencer thing and the wellness industry generally, because it feels as though we've turned healthiness and exercise, it speaks to your point about overexercising becoming normalized, it feels like we've turned that into a value metric in and of itself. What's your feeling about all of that?
Yeah, I think, again, when I was talking to this medic friend of mine, he was actually doing some research for a book, and that was why we were talking. And we were talking about the wellness industry, and I said, like, he just basically asked me, what's the difference between you and, say, these other practitioners that present themselves on Instagram with knowledge and information? Like, why are you so different? And I said, well, the difference is that, firstly, I never set out to have such a big following. Like, that was not, that's never the intention. But also, secondly, once I realized that I had a voice and people were interested in my voice, it was very much an opportunity to provide education and also an opportunity to be more accessible to as many people as possible, because I am very conscious not everybody has the funds to come and work with me. And I always feel a bit uncomfortable about that. But I think I was like, okay, well, through books, through podcasts, through social media, I can still provide good pieces of information and education that mean that people can benefit. And I get messages on a daily basis from people who say, I've never worked with you, but your content has really helped me, and I'm now on the path to recovery, or I've chosen to move away from this way of living. And that's very, very rewarding. But I also said to him, I was like, the big difference is that when someone comes to work with me, and you can advocate for me on this, when someone comes to work with me, I usually tell them that at some point you need to make me redundant. If you make me redundant, then I've done my job well, right? Like, at some point I want you to be able to walk out of this room knowing that you have autonomy over your choices, your body, your life. And I will hold your hand through that until you get to that point. But I'm not here for you to be dependent on, because then we're not really doing this properly. And he said, oh, that's the difference then, isn't it? He's like, a lot of these other people, they are trying to sell you something, and they are trying to keep you hooked in. And it's like, no, like the wellness industry is now no different to the pharmaceutical industry, the diet industry, the fitness industry. Everybody's trying to sell you something, but they're preying on the vulnerable and causing more problems so that person feels hooked into continuing to give that person money. And that's not what I'm about. Like, I very much want people to feel the care, be able to appreciate and experience the service that we give, but also leave knowing that they never have to come back. That's what I want. I'm not in this for a subscription model that means people never ever leave. That's not what we're here for. And I think the difference I would say between myself and some of these influencers is that I will always be authentic. I will always tell you as it is, and I will always advocate for the vulnerable, because I know, like I said right at the beginning, I know what it feels like to not be heard. I know what it feels like to not have a voice. And I don't want anybody else to feel like that. So I will always advocate for those that don't have a voice. And I think that's the difference. Whereas the wellness industry it's just basically a dressed up version of the diet industry. Let's face it, right? That's what it is now. It's not health, because true health is not about what you look like. True health is not really about whether you've got pretty pictures of food on your grid. True health is about health behaviors. If you're participating in behaviors that encourage you to feel well and are good for your well-being, then that's good, and some of those health behaviors will be things like, will be being a bit more mindful about some of the food choices you make, but also is about making sure you're eating enough of the foods you need to eat as well. And yes, it is about participating in exercise, but not to an extreme level, not to help your body feel comfortable. But also the most important thing for our well-being, and we know this because there's this massive study that was published in Harvard about it, is your ability to have social connection. And let's face it, we've both been there, where if you've got an exercise dependency and you've got an eating disorder, social connection goes out the window because your behaviors are a priority to you, not who you spend time with, or or whether you get to sit around a table and break bread, which is so important for our well-being. And so I think, I don't know if I've answered your question, but I guess kind of that's my take on influencers and the wellness industry, is that I feel, and I also feel like so many people have been duped. If you think back, we've had all these different, very high profile individuals who have sold us one thing, and then they've turned around and gone, oh, sorry, actually, yeah, I actually wasn't very well. I had an eating disorder when I sold you all that. So I'm really, really sorry, but I'm back now. And now I'm going to sell you this. And in a few years' time, they're going to come back and go, oh, I'm really sorry. That also wasn't true. So now I'm going to sell you this. And I think that's my problem, is this just the disingenuity of it. Now, I'm not saying they do it out of malice, and I'm not even saying they do it intentionally. I think they genuinely believe what they are doing is correct. But I think you shouldn't put yourself in that position unless you actually have hands-on experience of working in a field, or hands-on experience of working in that practice. And I think so this is why I think it's also really important not to just kind of go, oh yeah, they're a doctor, so they must know what they're talking about, because they may well be a doctor, but are they still registered as a doctor? Are they still practicing as a doctor? And actually, are they, even if they've got a podcast or whatever, are they actually bringing on guests that have got appropriate credentials? Because I think often, again, they get sucked into the popularity. There are so many podcasts, right? There are so many celebrity podcasts, and everybody wants to be in the top 10 or whatever it is. And so then they start sensationalizing their content as well by bringing in people who are controversial and cause problems. And, I do feel really strongly about this, because I see the consequence. I sat in clinic yesterday with a young woman who is in a real state, and she's talking to me about, but I've read this and I've heard this and I listened to this podcast and this is what they said, and I on this person's Instagram feed, this is what she said. And these are both people who have credentials, but actually they're also both people that are trying to sell you something. And she's so vulnerable that she has absorbed this and now she's in a right mess. And it makes me very angry because they don't understand the damage they are causing. And to me, that's irresponsible. So I always say this, I've said this ever since I started on Instagram, which was a long time ago, where I had like one follower. But I always said, as soon as you have a following, whether it's one or a million, you have a responsibility. And I think people need to take that seriously.
It's such an important point. It's that duty of care plus scope of practice. Because I think that there's a really, you can really simply clarify if you've got an audience that you're speaking from your own experience. It just doesn't take much. It's one sentence. From my experience, dot, 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 dot. Or you can be speaking from your expertise. But even when you're speaking from your expertise, you want to be able to encapsulate that there are so many variables and there are so many different experiences. And actually, as I was surveying your Instagram offering, what I was adoring actually was how diverse the content is, because one of the irritating hooks with social media is basically say the same thing in different ways that capture people's attention more and more and more and more. And you're right that in the world that we live in, the goal, the most monetizable thing and the most influence enhancing thing is grabbing someone's attention and keeping it, especially if you can dysregulate them enough to activate probably their addictive pathways to get them to spend money that they haven't paused to rationally consider. It's like, and I think the trouble is, especially coming from the background that and the work that I now do, a lot of which is looking at motive, identity, trauma. So many of the people that are seeking profile and platform in that way are just operating out of exactly the same wound that you were describing that you had and I had, which was, I'm not seen. But because it's shadow and it's sublimated and it's subversive, they're not even aware of that being the reason why they desire such a significant level of profile or even such a significant bank balance. So the whole thing gets really distorted.
Yeah, totally. And I'll let you into a secret. I hate videos. I hate doing them. And that's why my content is not very video heavy, because I don't like being in front of the camera really at all. So I'm very happy to write written content, but when I do now have someone who helps me with my social media, and she now has learned not to ask me for video content, because when she first started, she was like, "Do you think you could?" And I was like, "No." "Do you think no?" "Do you think no?" So I will do them occasionally when I feel like it's important, but I don't like having my phone with me all the time. I don't take my phone out when I go for walks. I don't really take photos of the hills when I'm running. Yeah, every now and again I might do, but I don't know. I'm just not that. I don't feel the need to capture every single minute of my life, because I'm living my life. And that is what I'm going to remember. Like when I'm on my deathbed, am I going to get my phone out and start scrolling my pictures? No, I'm not. I'm going to remember what I've been through and who I've spent time with. And that's going to be much more important to me, rather than, oh, I better capture this, like just not interested.
God, that's an awful testament to our time. Someone lying in their bed looking through their published content to try to understand the trajectory of the life that they've lived. I feel like it would be unfair not to ask you this, given that gateway. If we're talking about what's the difference between how it looks on the outside and how it feels on the inside, which is kind of what our lives have both been about, really. I wonder if you have a take on the kind of Ozempic tide and the normalization of skinniness. And, I'm really pleased to see that there are now voices that are saying, yes, but what is it doing to your inside to be indiscriminately losing fat and bone and muscle? But I just wonder what your much more eloquent expert take is on that than mine.
Well, I have written quite extensively about this, and I will continue to write extensively about this, because I do have concerns. Now, again, I want to caveat that there are definite demographics that do benefit from these GLP-1 medications. And I don't have an issue with people who need them using them. as long as they do have the wraparound support they need to use them appropriately. And what I mean by that is it's not just enough to have the GP. You do need to learn how to, kind of maybe reframe your relationship with food. And you do need to probably also have some direction with exercise. And again, I'm not talking about extreme of anything, just kind of helping people to appreciate. Because the problem is the way the mechanism of these drugs works is that you just don't have an appetite. So you're not necessarily learning how to eat better. You're just reducing the overall intake. And while that has the desired effects that it's meant to have, it doesn't necessarily solve, again, the root causes of why someone may have ended up in a larger body in the first place. And that's another thing. Like, I think this is another thing. I really hate the stigma of people in larger bodies, because I look at someone in a larger body and see them exactly in the same way as I see someone in an underweight body, is that there's a story there that needs to be understood. Now, sometimes, and again, in both situations, we know there's a genetic link to both, but we do know when it comes to obesity in particular, if you have two parents that are obese, there's an 80% likelihood that you will also be obese. So there's a big genetic factor going against you. And again, something that often people don't appreciate is that we are born with a certain number of fat cells based on that genetic blueprint. We can't change the number of fat cells we have, but we can change the size of the fat cells. But that does mean that some people will always be in a larger body. Now, I'm not saying that people should have extremely high BMIs where it's obviously negative and affected and has negative consequences on their health. That's not what I'm talking about. But I do think it's unfair that there are lots of people who are stigmatized when they're a bit overweight, but they're actually participating. Again, we go back to the health behaviors they're participating in. They are active. They're not smoking. They are limiting or moderating their alcohol intake. They don't drink huge quantities of energy drinks. Like, they're eating a Mediterranean diet, but they naturally, genetically are meant to be in bigger bodies. And I think if we continue to stigmatize these individuals, then we are going to end up with an even higher prevalence of eating disorders than we have right now.
You said to me, well, you wrote in some of your work, 16%.
Yeah. That's a huge, that was, and that was I think that was a 2020 statistic that 16% of the UK adult population has been diagnosed with an eating disorder. Now, that's not necessarily a restrictive eating disorder, but that is an eating disorder, which is massive. And yet we don't talk about that, do we? We always talk about, oh, well, this many percent of people are overweight and this many percent are obese, but we never talk about, well, what about the people that are struggling with eating disorders? And okay, there may be some overlap because some of the people who are in an obese body may well have, a binge eating disorder, and I'm not ignoring them. They're just as, but again, it goes back to, they've got a story. They need support. They need help. The number of people that I know who eat and are in an obese body because they were sexually assaulted or sexually abused as a kid, because actually being in a bigger body makes them feel safe. Who's helping them?
I can't remember the statistic on that, but it is shocking, the statistic of how many, particularly women. It's like I think it's 1 in 3.
So these women or men, they're already living with shame. And I know what that shame feels like when you've been sexually abused. Like, I know, even though I know it was not my fault, I understand that for a very long time, I kept thinking I should have stopped it. I felt shame at it happening to me. I felt shame that for me, particularly because I was very young, that it was my first sexual encounter. Like, there was so much tied up in that. But, women and men who are in larger bodies, they've already got this shame. They've got this lived shame of the experience they've been through. And then they are shamed even further. And they're shamed in their doctor's surgeries. They're shamed on the streets. It's not human. It's not nice. It's not kind. And ultimately, I think people have got to stop being judgmental and start looking at everybody as a human and understanding that every single one of us will have difficult and traumatic experiences that we're all dealing with and trying to work our way through. And sometimes that does express itself as being in a bigger body. Sometimes that does express itself as being in a very underweight and tiny body. But both people are suffering. And I think that's often really missed. And so the issue I have with the GLP-1 medications is not for the people that may benefit from it. It's for the people who don't need it. It's for the unregulated online pharmacies that are selling it to people and not checking whether this person actually needs it or not. You know, it's the fact that it's become a money-making machine for so many people, but also what it signifies. It's basically saying it's not okay to be who you are. Now we have we have something that means that you do not have to accept that that's normal for you. You can be what you want to be, because we keep telling everybody in the Western world that being smaller, being thinner is the only way to be accepted, except nobody's talking about the effects that has on your endocrine system, or on your bones, or on your digestive health, or on your mental health, right? Nobody's talking about that at all. Or, as we know, there are lots of side effects like the pancreas and the gallbladder, and it's I found it quite fascinating, actually. I was watching no judgment, I was watching some sort of American medical show the other day, and I don't watch too many, but every now and again I get sucked in, and I was watching one and there was this they'd even on there, somebody had come in who was like super, like slim now and whatever, but really severe pain, and basically had pancreatitis as a result of being on these medications. I was like, whoa, it's even like mainstream TV now. That is saying something. So I think I, I again, I go back to the pharmaceutical industry is profiting off vulnerable people. The medical industry needs to be much better educated. And I think medics need, and I say medics, I think everybody, but I think particularly medics, that they need to hold on to their training about being non-judgmental. You can't make an assumption on someone based on what they look like. And yet that's what the world does, isn't it? Like, I know if I walk down the street, people still make assumptions about me. They don't know me. They look at me, they go, oh, she's not from here. And they make an assumption about me. They don't know anything about me. They don't know that I was born in this country, that I help so many people, that I'm a good human, that, I like eating chocolate. They don't know any of that stuff about me. All they see is she's a brown person, she doesn't belong here. And that is where that's where they react from. And it's the same, I think I encourage everybody who's listening to think about your own bias. Like, I'm not saying that it's going to always be obvious, but I think just thinking about your own bias. Like, I was talking to my husband about this recently, because obviously we got married in October, and it's new for him to be in a, well, it's not new for him to be in a mixed relationship, because we've been together quite a long time, but obviously it's new for him in the grand scheme of his life. And he has learned so much about his own bias, but also about the bias of the world that we live in, because he never really saw it until he married a woman who wasn't white. And he, bless him, he's done so much education. We're very lucky up here in Cumbria. We have this incredible organization called Anti-Racist Cumbria, and they do amazing education sessions on how not just about not being racist, but how to be anti-racist. And he's joined the organization, he's doing the education, he's being, an incredibly supportive ally. But I guess like, I think, I know I've digressed, but I guess I just want people to be really conscious. It goes back to that, what you're talking about presence. I did my mindfulness practitioner training 3 years ago, mainly because I felt like I went down a path of doing mindfulness myself, as in I worked with a practitioner, and I realized that, oh, this is really good, and this could help so many of my clients as well. And I've always been, like you said, more present than most, but this really helped me. And I just think it's really important for everybody to every now and again just to stop and look inwards and reflect a little bit and kind of maybe just even watch yourself, observe yourself and kind of go, oh, yeah, I've noticed I've made a judgment of that person based on nothing, right? And that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying you should, but I'm not saying you should beat yourself up about that, but recognizing it before you act on it is the best thing you can do, because then you can become more conscious of, okay, that's something I need to work on, right? I'm not going to sit here and pretend that of course I've definitely judged people, 100%, but I'm really careful now because I'm like, oh, okay, that's not okay, and I tell myself it's not okay, and I pull back, and I think that's if we could teach one thing to kids at school, it would be learn to be aware of your judgment, because if you stop that, I think there would be so much less hatred and so much less war, and it would just be a slightly more peaceful and kind place.
I mean, love, it couldn't feel like a more timely message given everything that is going on in the world at the moment in every area, in politics, in wellness industry scandal. If we were to go back to the basic principle of what you're saying in non-judgment, what are we implying there? We're saying that other people don't have to be seen as a threat. They don't have to be seen as challengingly difficult. We go from this separation idea back into this social connection piece that you were speaking about so beautifully as the actual salve to so much of the pain that we find ourselves in. I do also just want to, really underline, I'm so grateful for your openness, particularly around both your experience with the ED and all that you have navigated in shifting your identity. But in terms of what you've been through with abuse, I think it's so important and also commendable that people that have gone through those experiences are, to whatever degree feels safe for them, open about it, because it is such a hidden issue. And you and I both know to navigate your way through that in a way that actually creates long-term health, body and mind, that's a huge devotion. And so I'm so pleased that you have, but I'm also so grateful for you sharing that for anyone that's listening that's been through any portion of what you describe. And I'm really, my heart is with all of you guys that relate to that. Renee, I have so adored this conversation, and I know that we could go on for probably hours. I'm going to really honor your very busy time, and I'm going to gently bring us to a close here. But I am going to ask you, before we fully close off, given that you're a woman that is deeply rooted in presence and led by your mission, I wonder if you could feel into the women and men that you feel really called to support, and you could just share a lasting message for them of what you think that they might need to hear from your voice and mouth.
I think I want everyone to know that you're worthy, regardless of what you've experienced, regardless of what you have been told. You are worthy. And one of the things that I have learned to embrace myself over the many, many years of evolving and also supporting others is that none of us need fixing. And if we listen deeply enough, we know what we need. And I think the final thing is that our mind is not often a reliable narrator. So while we can observe what our mind is telling us, I think it's good to be curious about what it's telling us and where that has come from. And actually, has it come from a place of threat because we are unregulated, we haven't slept well, we're hungry, we're tired, we're dehydrated, whatever it might be. And yeah, just to be a little bit more, I would say, to be a little bit more mindful of our mind.
You heard it here first, team. Love and be curious with your thoughts, but don't necessarily blanket trust them. Renee, I have adored this so much. Thank you for so much of your time and your insides and your insights. Listeners, viewers, we're going to make sure that you have every detail that you need to get in touch with this incredible woman and absolutely buy the secret book that she's currently secretly working on, and all of the 6 others that she's produced. We'll make sure all of that appears in the show notes, and really stay tuned. The rest of this season is as potent and profoundly meaningful as Renee's share today. So know that our commitment to you is, as ever, that we provide something of real depth and weight and healing and health in a world that can feel often deeply confusing. This is your place to learn. So we love you for being here, and we'll see you next time.